Welcome to this week's episode of the Oregon Minute. We are interviewing Kelly Petrie, the owner of the Maitri Center for Mindfulness Living, and she's also known as Oregon's Mindfulness Lady overall. Hi, Kelly. How's it going?
Hi, Emily. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So, how did you come to be known as the Mindfulness Lady in Oregon?
Oh my gosh, well that's a funny question, to be known as the Mindfulness Lady in the community. I think mainly because I started practicing mindfulness about 10 years ago or so, and shortly after I began practicing, I started to teach some classes in the community through Oregon Community Ed and Rec, and those were among some of the first classes that were offered. It's kind of when mindfulness was becoming just sort of integrated into different communities. It was sort of a new thing. And so I think just because I was one of the first people, at least in our local community, to offer this, that I just have been known as the Mindfulness Lady.
And so that notoriety led to you opening the Maitri Center for Mindful Living on Main Street. And so that has me curious, how has the center been doing, and how has it adapted to the pandemic?
Yeah, so I've been really fortunate over these years to be able to offer classes in other venues throughout the community, but it was always my dream to have my own place, just so that I had more flexibility in the types of classes I could teach and the different populations that I could serve. And so I was really happy to see that this building, the space in the Ham Chiropractic building, became available last October. And I kind of jumped on it because it had always been something I wanted to do. And of course, I didn't really have my grand opening until January because there was some time that I needed to set up and get things organized. And so I was open for not even quite a quarter before the pandemic set in. And so of course it's been extremely disappointing. But I'm very hopeful about it. Mainly because there are quite a few families and older students, adult students, who take my classes and they're very committed to their practice in mindfulness, that I've been able to offer classes virtually. So I've been able to sustain my business through the virtual classes, and that's been just really, it helps me to see the importance of these practices and why people are coming to them, but also gives me hope that when we can return to in-person classes, that I'll be able to just pick up where I left off.
And so, what is mindfulness?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it, right? Yeah, so I like to use a definition that is pretty simple. And so we can define mindfulness as paying attention with kindness to ourselves, others, and the world around us. And so there's an element of paying attention, of tapping into awareness. But this type of paying attention isn't just about like the cognitive ability to focus. It also includes an element of heartfulness. And that's a really important piece to this, because sometimes with the popularity that mindfulness is gaining, people start to interchange it with other concepts, but really getting down to the classical definition of mindfulness includes heartfulness, it includes compassion and tenderness and connection to others.
And so connection to others and connection to oneself has obviously been a little difficult during COVID-19. As well as other crises that have come as a result. How can we use those things you described during such a time of stress and intense emotion for a lot of people, and maybe use some examples from some of the classes you teach?
Sure. So one thing I might want to start with, though, is just sort of an expanded definition of mindfulness that also includes what is known as embodied presence. And I think this will help us to understand how we can apply this in a time of crisis like we're in right now. So embodied presence is a more complete expression of mindfulness, which allows us to tap into and access our sensory, our emotional, and our cognitive wisdom. And when we're able to access all of that completeness of ourselves, then it allows us to more readily, I'd say, like meet some of the circumstances of our lives that may not be so pleasant, right? So we can learn how to embrace fear or embrace uncertainty or even discomfort in a way that is more balanced and has a sense of resiliency to it. Another part of this embodied presence is that we're able to, it's kind of like you're able to bear witness to the range of emotions that may arise within yourself, but also bear witness to the pain and other unfortunate circumstances that are happening to others or externally. And so, in essence, what we're doing is by being grounded in our bodies, we can meet each unfolding moment with a sense of trust and a sense of spontaneity, and sort of release some of the impulse to want to control things which can't be controlled. So with that longer definition, one of the things that we can do in order to feel that sense of embodied presence is to, first of all, recognize when our mind has drifted towards other thoughts, like future-oriented thoughts or ruminating about the past, or even getting fixated on, all of the disappointment, the things that didn't happen because of the pandemic. We can notice when our mind has that tendency. It's very natural for it to do that. And then choose to bring our focus to something else. So not covering up those emotions, but actually choosing to focus on something else. And to be present in this moment, choosing to focus on some sensory experience can be really helpful. So for example, there's a really wonderful grounding practice where we just tune into all 5 of our senses. We're looking at each other right now, right? But do we really know that we're seeing each other, right? It's like we do on some level, but more of an automatic kind of level. But here it's like I can really take in your face, your body.
What's seen of my
what is
face?
seen, right? I can even, I'm sitting in this room, but I haven't really looked around the room, right, to see what shapes and colors and textures and shadows and things like that are present. You can even tune into sounds, right? So you can just sit quietly for even just 30 seconds and just tune into whatever sounds are arising. And sometimes we might be in a quiet environment and maybe we just touch into what the sound of silence is like, right? And even when we're paying attention in that way, it's not that we're seeking the pleasant sounds necessarily. We can include all kinds of sounds and then just learn to sit with that, to be with that. And any type of sensory experience, smell, taste, touch, can only happen in the present moment. And so it just grounds us right there, right then, right there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So, as I mentioned earlier, because this is such a chaotic time, and I think chaotic is an understatement for a lot of people, we can use mindfulness based on the definitions you gave to help us be present and focus on present outcomes or what's immediately in the moment, what we can control versus what's in the future. And so what are some strategies that you equip people with in your classes? Like what are some exercises you have them do? I remember when the Maitri Center first opened, you and I discussed, I remember, mindfulness eating or mindful eating. Yeah, maybe give me some examples.
Yeah, and that's a really wonderful example, the mindful eating practice. Even beyond pandemic time, usually we're so busy in our lives, right? And so many of us may even just multitask. So we might sit down for a meal, but we're still checking our text messages or even reading the newspaper or what have you, rather than actually just being present with the food that we are consuming in a way that allows us to taste the richness of the textures that we're putting into our mouth, or the tastes and the flavors and so forth. And so yes, in a class, whether it's a class for children or a class for adults, I almost always do a mindful eating exercise because it also brings in all of those 5 senses as well. But we also take it to another level. So while we're tasting our food, and maybe exploring the food in a slower way, we're also aware of our mind, right? So we're seeing how our mind responds to taking in information. I sometimes use a Hershey kiss, for example, as a way of doing mindful eating. And for a lot of people, it triggers a memory of, Hershey kisses in a bowl at grandma's house. And so you get to see how the mind generates a memory. Or there's a sense of disgust that can arise if it's a food that someone doesn't care for, and how that colors then the experience. And so there's this sense of familiarization with the habits of our mind. And once we become familiar with those habits, then we can start to disentangle some of the patterns that we have that allow us to engage in our everyday activities with fuller embodied presence.
So it's not about pushing the bad feelings out, but
Right.
rather, when you mention disgust, or any other negative emotion, it sounds like it's a strategy to be able to sit with those emotions or feelings, sensations, and be okay with them. Would you say that's an accurate assessment?
That's exactly it. Yes, absolutely, Emilie. That's right on. This is one of the things that I try to emphasize, because I think we are conditioned to try to cover up negative emotions and try to steer away from them and get rid of them. And mindfulness is taking this different approach. And it's actually what distinguishes it from relaxation practices specifically. Those are sometimes people interchange mindfulness and relaxation as one and the same, and certainly they have a very close relationship, right? They work very well together, but they're very different. And so in a relaxation practice, we are trying to intentionally induce this state of calm in our experience, that physiological feeling of being calm. But in mindfulness, that isn't necessarily the goal. The goal is, exactly as you said, learning to be with the circumstances of our lives in whatever way they are showing up, whether they are pleasant or unpleasant, an uncomfortable emotion, a very comfortable emotion, seeing how the habits of mind relate to those different things. And once we learn how to bring a sense of balance and be able to be with our experiences in that way, what often happens as a byproduct is a sense of calm, the sense of okayness. So that's how they're related, but they have sort of different goals in that regard.
And so how can being okay with those negative emotions, say, for example, if we have a family member who is sick with COVID, or I'll even, go as far as saying a family member who has endured police brutality, things like that, things that make us uncomfortable and things that make us angry. How can we benefit from sitting with those emotions? First, there's the element of calm you mentioned, but how does it help us grow?
Yeah, so this is a really important question that you're asking, because sometimes I think that when we talk about mindfulness being all about compassion, that it means that we're taking a back seat to things that need our action in a really sort of direct and fierce kind of way. There's this thing called fierce compassion. And so what we want to check in with in those different circumstances and how we're meeting those circumstances is if we are meeting them with a sense of reactivity versus more of a skillful response, right? And so mindfulness is teaching us and helping us to sort of take a little bit of a pause so that we can see what our gut reaction is, blurting something out, reacting in such a way, and then just sort of taking a pause to allow this inner wisdom to arise, right? That embodied presence that accesses all of those different emotions. Well, there's wisdom that's embedded in that from this contemplative perspective. And so we can access that in a certain way. But certainly there are circumstances, for example, if a young parent and their child are walking down the street and their child is running into the street, we need to be reactive, right? We don't want to take a pause. That might actually be dangerous. So it's not saying that there aren't appropriate times to react, but this is just allowing us to see what's being stirred up in us and how we can meet those circumstances in the most skillful way that will be beneficial for all.
So obviously you have a lot of knowledge regarding mindfulness and its practices and strategies for attaining mindfulness. Can you delve a little bit into your background and how you discovered mindfulness?
Yeah. So probably about 10 years ago, or maybe it's even been a dozen years now, it just feels like yesterday, but it's been quite a while. I was going through a period in my life where I was feeling a lot of anxiety and panic, partly because I was kind of just moving into a different phase of my life. My children were getting older. I was working in the Oregon School District as a paraprofessional, very interested in education, but not what my background is. And I was just sort of like trying to figure out what I wanted to do next. And there was just a lot of anxiety happening. And just by happenstance, I learned about meditation, and I started to just kind of delve into it just a little bit. And almost immediately, I really started to feel this greater sense of ease in my being, and helped me to see a little bit more clearly where I wanted to go with my life. And from that, I discovered a program at Naropa University, which is a small college in Colorado.
Boulder, Colorado?
In Boulder,
Yeah,
Colorado,
I've
that's
been there.
right, yeah. And the program was in something called contemplative education. And so it sort of brought together these two worlds, right? I had this interest in education, and I was starting to be very interested in meditation. And so I looked into it, and I enrolled in a class as a non-program student. And almost immediately I realized that that was where my heart was. Like, I really just became very interested in this way of educating others to really just get in deeper touch with themselves so that they can be of greater benefit to the world around them, to their loved ones and others, their community, and so forth. And so that program was extraordinarily transformative for me. It's really where I started to delve much deeper in my meditation practice. I joined a local meditation community in Madison and really just started to practice while also going to school. And upon graduating from that program is when I decided that it's something that I wanted to share with others, and also use that philosophy to embed in the way that I teach others, right? Because contemplative education isn't about how to teach mindfulness to people. It's really a philosophy of education that's all about touching into awareness, insight, and compassion, and embedding that in the way that we teach and interact with our students. So, yeah.
Well, Kelly, I think that I have all of my questions answered, but really quick, is there anything else that you would like to discuss? Anything you felt like I missed during our interview today?
Well, one thing that I just wanted to make a little bit clear, especially for your viewers, is that I'm an educator, I'm not a clinician, and I know that many people hear in the news how beneficial mindfulness can be for anxiety, for stress, and so forth. But I also just like to caution people that if they are feeling high levels of stress or anxiety, deep sadness, depression, that those are things that they should definitely speak to their clinician about, and then maybe in conjunction with their doctor or their therapist can explore classes that are in mindfulness. I just feel like that's an important distinction to make, because mindfulness isn't really about fixing anything. It's just learning how to be with the circumstances of our lives in a way that is supportive. And for some people, it may not be the most supportive thing that they need at that time.
It's something that can certainly help, but it shouldn't be, like you're saying, the end-all, be-all
Exactly.
solution.
Yeah,
It's a part of a
absolutely.
bigger picture of, it sounds like of receiving help, perhaps from a therapist or what have you, being
That's
surrounded by
right.
loved ones, and then practicing mindfulness along with that. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I appreciate you clarifying that. But thank you so much for coming on the show today, Kelly, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers will benefit from the advice you gave us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for viewing this week's Oregon Minute. Tune in every Thursday at 7 p.m.